I stood beside Margaret's grave long after everyone else had begun walking toward their cars. The July sun hung low over the cemetery outside Raleigh, casting long shadows across rows of polished headstones that seemed to stretch forever. 45 years of marriage had ended beneath a rectangle of freshly turned earth, and the silence that followed the final prayer felt heavier than anything I had ever carried. People had warned me that the house would feel empty after the funeral. They were wrong. The emptiness had started the moment I watched the casket disappear beneath white lilies. Margaret had always believed flowers should be planted where people could watch them bloom, not arranged around grief for a single afternoon. Looking at the expensive displays surrounding her grave, I could almost hear her teasing voice. Someone paid too much for those roses. Ethan. The thought nearly made me smile. Nearly. Friends from church offered quiet hugs before leaving. Former neighbors squeezed my shoulder. A few of Daniel's co-workers introduced themselves, saying how much they admired the woman who had raised such a brilliant biomedical engineer. I thanked each of them, though their faces blurred together. Grief had a strange way of making the world look as though it were happening behind thick glass. Daniel stayed close for most of the service. At 41, he looked more tired than I had ever seen him. Dark circles framed eyes that had spent months moving between hospital rooms and research laboratories. During Margaret's final year, he had tried to divide every hour between developing his medical device, visiting his mother, and answering endless calls from investors. He had slept very little and blamed himself for every moment he wasn't at her bedside. I knew my son well enough to recognize guilt when I saw it. None of it belonged to him. Margaret had never wanted anyone watching her fade away. She had wanted us to keep living. Standing beside Daniel was his wife, Savannah. She wore a perfectly tailored black dress that probably cost more than Margaret had spent on clothes in 5 years. Her makeup remained untouched despite the tears she had displayed during the funeral. Even now, with most guests gone, she looked composed in a way that felt carefully practiced rather than natural. She placed a gentle hand on Daniel's arm. "We should get your dad home," she said softly. Daniel nodded without looking at me. "Yeah, Dad, let's go." Home. The word caught somewhere inside my chest. Margaret would never walk through our front door again. She would never complain about the tomatoes growing too close together in the garden or remind me to water the hydrangeas before breakfast. She would never leave handwritten notes inside library books telling me which chapters she thought I'd love. The house waiting for me wasn't really home anymore. Still, it was the last place where every corner carried her laughter. We began walking toward the parking lot. Gravel crunched beneath our shoes. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass mixed with funeral flowers. No one spoke until we reached Savannah's SUV. She turned toward me with a sympathetic smile. "Ethan," she began carefully, "Daniel and I have been talking about what comes next." Something in her tone made Victor Sullivan, who had been quietly following several steps behind us, stop walking. Victor had been my closest friend for more than 40 years. We had met when I was still working for the IRS, and he was a detective with the Raleigh Police Department. Retirement had added gray hair to both of us, but it had never dulled his instincts. He looked at Savannah the same way he once looked at suspicious witnesses. Savannah continued before anyone could answer. "We're worried about you living alone." I nodded politely. "I appreciate that." "The house is really too much for one person." Daniel finally spoke. Maybe Savannah's right. Dad." His voice carried hesitation rather than conviction. "You shouldn't have to manage everything by yourself." Savannah gently squeezed his hand, encouraging him. "There are some wonderful assisted living communities nearby," she said. "Beautiful places, safe, they have nurses on staff, activities every day, people your own age." She paused, studying my face. "You wouldn't have to worry about maintaining that big old house anymore." For a moment, I simply stared at her. Margaret had been buried less than an hour. Our wedding rings had barely stopped touching each other inside the casket. Yet someone was already discussing where I should spend the rest of my life. I've lived in that house for 45 years, I answered quietly. I know. Her smile never changed, but things change. She reached into her leather portfolio and removed a neat stack of documents. I actually spoke with an elder care attorney last week, just to understand the options. Victor's eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. Savannah held out the papers. Nothing has to happen today. We simply thought it would be responsible if you signed a few preliminary forms. I looked down. At the top of the first page were the words Durable Power of Attorney. Beneath it sat another document concerning medical information and healthcare authorization. The pages remained perfectly organized with colored tabs marking each signature line. Prepared. Waiting. Something cold settled inside me. Margaret had spent nearly a year fighting cancer. Somewhere during that year, Savannah had found time to organize legal paperwork for the day after her funeral. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. Dad, nobody's forcing you. No, Savannah added smoothly. We're only trying to make sure someone can help if there's ever an emergency. She spoke with kindness. Anyone standing nearby would have admired her compassion, but compassion never arrives carrying signature tabs. I slowly handed the papers back without opening them. I won't be signing anything today. Her smile flickered for the first time. You don't even want to read them. Not today. Ethan, these are just precautions. I said no. The words remained calm, but they carried enough finality that Daniel looked from me to his wife in confusion. Savannah recovered almost instantly. Of course, she said. You're grieving. We understand. There was another pause. Then she added, almost casually, we should also start thinking about the house. It's probably going to go through probate anyway, and the maintenance costs are substantial. Victor took one deliberate step forward. The house discussion can wait. Savannah looked at him with polite annoyance. I'm only trying to help. I didn't say you weren't. His voice stayed even. I said it can wait. Daniel sighed heavily. Can we not do this here? Nobody answered. The wind stirred the ribbons tied around several flower arrangements. Somewhere across the cemetery, another funeral service had begun. A minister's voice drifted faintly through the trees. Savannah finally slipped the documents back into her portfolio. All right, she said. We'll talk another day. She opened the passenger door for Daniel. I'll drive your father home later if he needs anything. Before I could respond, Victor rested a hand on my shoulder. Actually, he said, Ethan's coming with me first. I turned toward him. For what, his expression didn't change. Something Margaret asked me to do. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? Victor looked directly at him. Your mother left instructions. Savannah's eyes narrowed for the briefest moment before her pleasant expression returned. I didn't know Margaret had made any special arrangements. Most people didn't. Victor met my eyes. We shouldn't keep her waiting. I looked once more toward the fresh grave where 45 years of my life now rested beneath white flowers. Then I followed my oldest friend away from the cemetery, not toward my home, but toward a destination Margaret had somehow prepared before she died. For the first time that day, grief gave way to something else. Not hope, not yet, only a quiet feeling that my wife had not finished protecting our family. Victor did not explain where we were going until the cemetery had disappeared behind us. He drove with both hands fixed on the steering wheel, his shoulders rigid beneath an old navy jacket. The silence between us was not uncomfortable, but it carried a weight I had never felt in our friendship before. Victor had known Margaret almost as long as I had. If she had trusted him with something she had hidden from me, then whatever waited at the end of that road was not small. We left the suburbs and turned toward an older industrial section south of Raleigh. Most of the factories there had closed years ago, leaving behind brick buildings with broken windows, rusted loading docks, and weeds growing through cracked pavement. Victor finally pulled beside a narrow warehouse that looked no different from the abandoned structures surrounding it. He turned off the engine but did not move. Margaret came to me 8 months ago, he said. She was already sick, though she hadn't told many people how bad it had become. I stared at him. You knew I knew she needed help. I didn't know how much time she had. The answer hurt more than I expected. For a moment, grief sharpened into anger. You kept this from me. Victor accepted the accusation without defending himself. She made me promise. She was my wife. I know. His voice softened. She said you had spent the last year being her husband. She wanted you to remain her husband. Ethan, not her investigator. I looked away toward the warehouse. Margaret had always understood the part of me I had buried better than anyone else. She knew that once I saw a pattern, I could not leave it alone. She also knew I would have sacrificed our final months together trying to solve whatever frightened her. Victor reached into his pocket and placed a brass key in my palm. She told me to bring you here after the funeral, not before. The lock on the side door opened easily. Inside, the air smelled of dust, paper, and stale coffee. Victor switched on a row of fluorescent lights, and the darkness withdrew from the room one strip at a time. I stopped just beyond the doorway. The warehouse was not filled with furniture or boxes of family belongings. 3 long tables stood beneath large corkboards mounted across the walls. The boards held bank statements, printed emails, corporate filings, property records, photographs, and handwritten timelines. Colored pins connected names to companies and companies to accounts. Every page had been labeled in Margaret's careful handwriting. At the center of the far wall was a photograph of Savannah. Beside it was a photograph of a silver-haired man I did not recognize. A woman rose from behind one of the tables. She was in her mid-40s, dressed in dark slacks and a plain gray blouse. Her expression was calm, but not cold. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "my name is Rachel Kim. I'm a licensed private investigator. Your wife hired me 14 months ago." I looked from her to Victor, then back to the walls. Margaret built all of this. She found the first irregularity. Rachel replied, "I helped her document what followed." She explained that Margaret had noticed unexplained withdrawals from an account connected to Daniel's medical startup. At first, she believed it might be an accounting error. Then she found a transfer authorization carrying Daniel's signature on a date when he had been at the hospital with her all day. Margaret had asked Savannah about it privately. Savannah claimed Daniel had signed the document earlier. Margaret did not believe her. Rachel pointed toward the photograph of the silver-haired man, Richard Hale, founder of Hale Meridian Ventures. His firm has been advising Daniel on outside investment. "And Savannah?" I asked. Rachel hesitated before answering. "They have been meeting privately for nearly 2 years." The room seemed to tilt beneath me. On one board were photographs of Savannah entering restaurants, offices, and a downtown hotel with Richard. On another were copies of altered contracts connected to Daniel's patent. Margaret had not been imagining a family disagreement. She had uncovered a deliberate effort to transfer parts of Daniel's work into companies linked to Richard. My son had spent 6 years developing that device. Margaret had spent her final year proving someone was stealing it. Rachel walked to a small table and turned on a laptop. "She left a recording for you." Margaret appeared on the screen, seated in the sunroom of our home. A blanket covered her shoulders, and the illness had made her face thinner, but her eyes remained steady. "Ethan," she began, "if you are watching this, then I am gone, and I am sorry for one more goodbye." My knees weakened. Victor pulled a chair behind me, and I sat without taking my eyes from her face. Margaret explained that Savannah had been moving money, altering documents, and helping Richard gain control over Daniel's patent. She also believed Savannah had begun collecting examples of my forgetfulness, grief, and exhaustion to support a future claim that I could no longer manage my own affairs. "She may try to frighten you into signing documents," Margaret said. "Do not sign anything without Laura Bennett present." The name meant nothing to me yet. Margaret drew a slow breath. "Please protect Daniel, but remember that he has been deceived, not lost. Protect yourself, too. Your age does not erase your judgment, and grief does not make you incompetent." Her voice trembled for the first time. "I know what this will awaken in you. I know the man you used to be, and I know how fiercely you fight when someone threatens your family. But do not become cruel for me. Follow the truth. Let the law do what anger cannot." She looked directly into the camera, as though she could still see me. Do not become someone I would not recognize. The screen went dark. For several seconds, I could hear only the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Then the grief I had held together through hospitals, prayers, condolences, and the burial finally broke through me. I lowered my head into my hands and wept for my wife, for the secret burden she had carried, and for the love that had kept protecting us even when her body no longer could. I remained in the warehouse until the light outside the high windows began to fade. Rachel gave me space to grieve, while Victor stood near the door with his arms folded across his chest. Neither of them tried to fill the silence. Margaret had chosen them because they understood that some truths could not be absorbed through conversation. They had to settle slowly, like dust after something heavy had fallen. When I finally lifted my head, Rachel placed a sealed folder on the table in front of me. "Your wife wanted you to see this next," she said. The folder was thicker than the others and had my full name written across the front in Margaret's careful handwriting. I opened it and found copies of records I had not looked at in more than 20 years, federal commendations, investigative summaries, security clearances, and newspaper clippings from cases I had tried hard to forget. Victor glanced at the first page and gave a quiet whistle. "I knew you worked for the government," he said. "I never knew it was this. Most people did not." To our neighbors. I had been a retired postal supervisor who spent too much time trimming hedges and listening to old jazz records. Daniel knew I had once worked for the Internal Revenue Service, but he had been too young to remember what that work had required. Margaret was the only person who understood the full truth. Before I became a man who measured his mornings by coffee and garden chores, I had been a senior forensic auditor assigned to complex financial crimes. I followed money through shell companies, false invoices, offshore accounts, and corporate structures designed to make theft look respectable. I had helped dismantle fraud networks that had operated for years behind polished offices and charitable foundations. My work rarely appeared in headlines, but it had sent men with expensive lawyers to federal prison. Numbers had always spoken clearly to me. People could change their stories. Documents could be altered. Witnesses could be frightened or bought. But money left patterns, and patterns carried intention. Rachel watched me examine the files. "Margaret believed you would know what these records meant," she said. "I do." My voice sounded unfamiliar, even to me. It was steadier now. At the bottom of the folder was a photograph of me at 38, standing outside a federal courthouse in Washington. I wore a dark suit and held a briefcase against my side. My posture was straight, my expression severe, and there was very little softness in my eyes. I remembered that man. I also remembered why I had left him behind. Daniel had been 7 when the doctors discovered a congenital heart defect that had gone unnoticed since infancy. What began as fatigue and shortness of breath became months of appointments, surgery, complications, and long nights beside a hospital bed. Margaret continued teaching because we needed the stability, while I tried to balance investigations in 3 states with a child who woke from anesthesia, asking whether his father would still be there in the morning. One night, I arrived at the hospital after midnight. Daniel was asleep, but Margaret sat beside him with her coat still on and a stack of ungraded essays in her lap. "He stopped asking when you were coming," she told me. She did not accuse me. That made the words hurt more. The following week, I resigned. My supervisors called it a waste. One offered me a promotion if I stayed. Another reminded me that careers like mine did not reopen once a man walked away. I thanked them, turned in my credentials, and accepted a quieter federal position before eventually moving into postal administration. The work was ordinary, the hours predictable, and the health insurance dependable. For the first time in years, I was home for dinner. I attended Daniel's therapy appointments. I learned which foods he could tolerate after surgery. I sat beside him through sleepless nights and helped him build model airplanes when his body was still too weak for sports. Years later, when he chose biomedical engineering, he told me he wanted to create something that would spare other children from the fear he had known. I had never regretted leaving the IRS. Not once. Still, as I stood inside Margaret's hidden warehouse, the instincts I had buried began returning with unsettling clarity. I no longer saw a confusing wall of papers. I saw transaction sequences, concealed ownership, unusual timing, and the deliberate movement of assets between entities that appeared separate but were controlled by the same people. Margaret had not left me a collection of suspicions. She had left me the beginning of a case. Rachel opened a cabinet and removed a long garment bag. This was also part of her instructions. I unzipped it and found the charcoal suit I had worn during my final federal investigation. Margaret had kept it all these years. The fabric was carefully pressed, and one of her handwritten notes was pinned inside the collar. You were never weak. You simply chose gentleness. I carried the suit into the small washroom at the back of the warehouse and changed. When I stepped before the narrow mirror, the years were visible in my face, but the man looking back at me no longer seemed lost. Victor studied me when I returned. "Well," he said quietly, "there you are." I adjusted one cuff and looked again at Savannah's photograph on the central board. Anger moved through me, sharp and immediate, but Margaret's final warning remained stronger. "Do not become someone I would not recognize." I removed the jacket, folded it carefully over my arm, and placed it back inside the garment bag. "Not yet," I said. There was still too much I did not know, and a good investigator never stepped into the light before understanding where every shadow led. I returned home shortly before 9 that evening. Victor parked at the curb and offered to stay, but I told him I needed a few hours alone. The lights were on in the living room, and through the front window, I could see Daniel sitting on the sofa with his elbows on his knees. Savannah stood near the fireplace, speaking quietly into her phone. She ended the call as soon as I entered. "Where have you been?" Daniel asked. His concern sounded genuine, but exhaustion had made it thin. "Victor took me for a drive." Savannah watched me remove my coat. For several hours, I lost track of time. That answer pleased her more than it should have. She stepped closer, softening her expression. "Ethan, that is exactly what worries us. You disappeared after an emotional funeral and no one knew where you were. Victor knew, but Daniel didn't." She glanced at my son, placing the weight of the moment carefully between us. Daniel stood and crossed the room. "Dad, we were worried. Savannah called twice. My phone was still in my coat pocket. I had turned the sound off during Margaret's recording and forgotten to turn it back on. It was an ordinary mistake, the kind anyone might make after burying a spouse. Yet I saw the way Savannah stored it away, not as an explanation, but as evidence. "I'm sorry," I said. "It won't happen again." Her eyes narrowed slightly, perhaps expecting resistance. Instead, I gave her none. Over the next 2 days, Savannah began building her story. She did it patiently, using small moments that appeared harmless when viewed alone. At breakfast, she asked me what day it was, though a newspaper sat open beside my plate. When I answered correctly, she smiled and changed the subject. Later, she asked whether I had taken my blood pressure medication, then quietly recorded my response on her phone. That afternoon, she moved my car keys from the hook beside the kitchen door. When I looked for them, she watched from the hallway. "Are you sure you didn't leave them in the refrigerator again?" she asked. "I've never left my keys in the refrigerator." She laughed as though I had made a joke. Daniel heard only the laughter. The following morning, Savannah placed an empty saucepan on the stove and left one burner turned low. She then called Daniel into the kitchen and pointed toward it. "Your father forgot again." I stood in the doorway, watching her. I didn't turn that burner on. Her face changed immediately. Concern replaced accusation. "Ethan, I watched you do it." Daniel looked between us. His shoulders sagged beneath another problem he did not have the strength to examine. "Dad, maybe you just don't remember." There are moments when defending yourself is necessary. There are others when a denial only strengthens the lie surrounding you. Margaret had understood that. Laura Bennett understood it as well. I met Laura that afternoon in Victor's dining room. She was a composed woman in her mid-50s. with silver beginning to show in her dark hair and the careful manner of someone accustomed to families in crisis. Margaret had hired her the previous year to revise our estate plan and place the house inside a revocable living trust. The house is protected, Laura explained. Savannah cannot sell it merely because she obtains a power of attorney. But that does not mean she cannot make your life difficult. She opened a legal pad. Rachel found evidence that Savannah contacted a physician named Dr. Colin Mercer. He performs private cognitive evaluations and has previously worked with one of Richard Hale's charitable foundations. Is he corrupt? We cannot claim that without proof. What we know is that Savannah scheduled an evaluation for you without your consent and has been asking questions about emergency guardianship. Victor leaned forward. She can't just declare him incompetent. No, Laura said. A court would have to decide. Ethan would have counsel and the right to present his own medical evidence. But an emergency petition can create temporary restrictions if Savannah convinces a judge that he is an immediate danger to himself or others. The room grew quiet. For the first time since entering Margaret's warehouse, I felt something colder than anger, fear. Not fear of Savannah herself, but of how quickly a false story could become an official record, a misplaced object, a grieving widower's sleeplessness, a doctor willing to accept one family member's version of events. Those pieces could be arranged to make a capable man appear helpless. Victor looked at me. We stop this now. Laura shook her head. Not yet. Right now, Savannah believes Ethan is confused and isolated. That confidence may make her careless. If we confront her before we know the full plan, she will destroy documents and change tactics. So I let her continue. I asked, "You let her believe she is continuing." I understood the distinction. That evening, I began giving Savannah what she expected. I paused before answering simple questions. I asked Daniel whether he had already gone to work when he had returned only minutes earlier. I allowed my hand to tremble while pouring coffee, then apologized when a little spilled onto the table. Each performance cost me something. Daniel's expression became more troubled. Savannah's became calmer. 2 days later, she entered the kitchen carrying a cream-colored folder and found me staring through the window toward Margaret's garden. "I spoke with someone who can help us," she said gently. "A doctor is coming tomorrow." I turned slowly. "Why, to make sure you're safe." She placed the folder on the table. The top page bore the heading, "Petition for Emergency Guardianship." Savannah believed the frightened old man standing before her was only beginning to understand what she had arranged. She had no idea that I had already read every line of her plan reflected in Margaret's evidence, and that my apparent confusion was the first deliberate step in dismantling it. The next morning, I returned to the warehouse before sunrise. Margaret had arranged the evidence with the patience of a teacher preparing lessons for students who might never sit in the same room. Yet the files were not complete in the way a federal case needed to be. They contained fragments, each useful alone, but dangerous without context. Rachel had photographs, travel records, and public corporate filings. Laura had the trust documents, records of Savannah's attempts to access our estate, and notes from Margaret's meetings. Victor had dates, conversations, and the memory of every frightened visit Margaret had made to his house. Marcus Reed, my former IRS colleague, arrived carrying only a legal pad and the caution of a man who respected boundaries. "I'm retired," Marcus said. "I cannot open government databases, pull private bank records, or make calls on your behalf. I didn't ask you to. No, but grief makes decent men ask for things they would normally refuse." He studied me. "What I can do is tell you which evidence matters, which agencies may have jurisdiction, and how not to contaminate what Margaret collected." That was enough. We spent the morning separating fact from suspicion. Rachel had documented meetings between Savannah and Richard Hale, but an affair did not prove fraud. Laura found that Savannah requested copies of Daniel's company documents while claiming she was helping with estate planning, but access alone did not prove theft. Victor remembered Margaret saying Savannah had threatened her, but memory without a recording could be challenged. Each person held one corner of the truth. Only when I placed the pieces together did the pattern appear. 3 months before Margaret hired Rachel, Daniel's company had paid a consulting invoice to Northline Strategy Group. The amount was small enough to avoid attention. Rachel's search showed that Northline shared a registered agent with a holding company connected to Hale Meridian Ventures. Laura's notes showed Savannah had asked Margaret to persuade Daniel to give her temporary signing authority during the same week. Victor remembered Margaret arriving at his house afterward, shaken and carrying a copy of the invoice. Marcus leaned over the table. "One transfer is not a conspiracy." "No," I said, "but it is a test." The first payment had been small. The next had been larger. Each transfer followed a moment when Daniel was distracted by his mother's illness, a failed funding meeting, or an equipment emergency. Someone was measuring how closely he watched his own accounts. Rachel opened another folder. "Margaret told me not to show you this until you had reviewed the timeline." Inside was a transcript and an audio file. Margaret had recorded a conversation in our sunroom 11 months earlier. Because she had participated in it, the recording had been made lawfully. Rachel pressed play. Margaret's voice was weak but calm. "I know about Northline. I know Richard Hale is receiving money from Daniel's company, and I know Daniel did not approve every transfer." Savannah remained silent before answering. "You've been sick for a long time, Margaret. Medication can make people suspicious. I have copies. You have papers you do not understand. I understand my son's signature." Margaret drew a careful breath. "End the relationship with Richard. Return what you moved. Tell Daniel the truth, and I will help you find a lawyer. You may still repair some of this." Even after discovering the betrayal, Margaret had offered mercy. Savannah laughed softly. "You think Daniel will believe a dying woman over his wife by the time you're gone? He will be too exhausted to question anything. Ethan will be alone. Daniel will need me. And all of this will look like grief, confusing an old family." Victor lowered his eyes. Laura stopped writing. "You are mistaking kindness for blindness," Margaret said. Savannah's chair scraped against the floor. "And you are mistaking your remaining time for power." The recording ended with our front door closing. For a long moment, no one spoke. Margaret had known what Savannah was becoming, yet she had offered her a path back. Savannah had not acted from panic or necessity. She had been warned, given a chance, and chosen to continue. I looked again at the wall. The case was no longer a collection of financial questions. It was a sequence of deliberate choices. Marcus tapped the Northline invoice. "Now we know where to begin." I nodded. "Not with revenge. Not with accusation." With the first lie, Savannah believed no one had noticed. Daniel had always been easy to admire from a distance. At 41, he had already published research in respected medical journals, built a small biomedical company from a rented laboratory, and developed a device that could improve how physicians monitored children with congenital heart conditions. Reporters described him as disciplined and visionary. Investors praised his focus. None of them saw what that focus had cost him. He usually left the house before sunrise and returned after dark, carrying the smell of antiseptic laboratories and stale coffee. During Margaret's illness, his life had narrowed into a relentless path between hospital visits, engineering meetings, funding calls, and sleepless nights reviewing test data. He answered emails during meals, and sometimes fell asleep fully dressed on the living room sofa. Savannah had gradually taken over everything outside his work bills: insurance forms, legal documents, travel arrangements, and access to several company accounts. At first, Daniel had been grateful. Savannah framed control as care. She reminded him of appointments, filtered calls she considered unimportant, and told him which problems could wait until morning. When Margaret's condition worsened, Savannah began answering messages from our family before Daniel saw them. If I called during a laboratory meeting, she told him I was worried about something minor. If Margaret asked him to visit, Savannah sometimes said his mother had become confused about the day. Each lie rested beside a small piece of truth. Margaret had forgotten an appointment once after chemotherapy. I had repeated a question during an exhausting week. Daniel had missed several family dinners because his device failed an important safety test. Savannah did not invent chaos from nothing. She arranged real moments into a story that made her seem like the only dependable person in his life. I watched the results from across our kitchen table. Daniel came home late on the evening after Dr. Mercer's visit. The physician had asked me basic questions, then spent more time speaking privately with Savannah than evaluating me. I had answered some questions correctly and pretended uncertainty on others, careful not to perform so poorly that an honest professional would have reason to intervene. Daniel placed his laptop bag on the floor and looked at me. "How did the evaluation go?" "Your father was tired," Savannah answered before I could speak. "Doctor, Mercer thinks there are enough concerns to continue." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "Enough concerns for what further assessment? Temporary supervision? Maybe. Guardianship? Only if necessary." She spoke gently, as though the word carried no threat. Daniel looked toward me. For one moment, I saw the boy who used to search my face before entering an operating room. "Dad, I'm not trying to take anything from you." "I know," I said. His relief came too quickly. He wanted to believe that understanding his intentions was the same as accepting Savannah's plan. Later that night, I passed his study and found him sitting beneath the desk lamp, staring at a photograph of Margaret holding him as a child. His computer displayed dozens of unanswered emails. A cold cup of coffee sat beside a stack of patent documents. "She wanted to tell me something," he said without looking up. I stopped in the doorway. When the week before she went into hospice, she asked me to come alone. "Did you?" He shook his head. "I had a meeting with Hale Meridian. Savannah said Mom was confused from the medication and that I should wait until the next morning." His voice tightened. There wasn't another morning when she was awake long enough. I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to play Margaret's recording, place the photographs before him, and free him from the woman who had turned his exhaustion into a weapon. But Rachel and Laura had both warned me that Savannah monitored his email and controlled many of his files. If he confronted her too early, Richard would know we had discovered the scheme. So I remained in the doorway, carrying a truth my son was not ready to receive. "Your mother knew you loved her," I said. Daniel looked down. Sometimes love should have looked more like showing up. The words stayed between us. The next morning, Savannah left for an appointment. Daniel went into the kitchen searching for a financial statement related to an upcoming investor presentation. She usually prepared those documents for him, but one folder had been left inside her locked desk drawer. He found the spare key in the household cabinet and opened it. A printed bank record lay beneath several medical forms bearing my name. Daniel scanned the page, then went still. The statement showed a transfer from his company to Northline Strategy Group. The authorization contained his electronic signature, but the transaction had been approved at 2:17 on a Tuesday afternoon. At that exact time, Daniel had been inside the pediatric wing of Wake Medical Center, holding Margaret's hand during a procedure. His phone had been turned off, his laptop locked inside his office, and Savannah had been the only person with access to both. He read the transfer twice, then a third time. When Savannah returned, Daniel had replaced every document exactly where he had found it. He said nothing to her that evening. But for the first time in their marriage, my son watched his wife speak and wondered which part of her answer had been prepared before he asked the question. Richard Hale had built his reputation by making failure look like strategy. His offices occupied the top floors of a glass tower in downtown Raleigh, where every wall displayed photographs of him beside governors, university presidents, and young founders whose companies had later appeared in business magazines. To the public, Hale Meridian Ventures represented confidence, precision, and access to money that seemed almost limitless. The truth was less impressive. Richard was wealthy, but he was not a billionaire. Most of what people called his fortune existed in company valuations, pledged assets, and investment funds he managed for other people. His personal homes were mortgaged. His private aircraft was leased. Even the artwork in his conference room belonged to a corporate collection financed through debt. For years, the illusion had worked because new investors continued placing money into his funds. Richard used one successful deal to cover the losses of another. shifting obligations between companies and delaying the moment when anyone examined the entire structure at once. That moment was approaching. Marcus helped me understand the public filings, while Rachel traced the companies connected to Richard's recent investments. Several had failed quietly. One medical software company had collapsed after federal regulators rejected its data. A surgical equipment startup had burned through nearly $20 million without producing a marketable product. Hale Meridian's largest credit facility required the firm to maintain specific asset values, and the losses had pushed Richard dangerously close to violating those conditions. He doesn't need Daniel's patent because he believes in the technology, I said, studying the reports spread across the warehouse table. He needs it because the patent can be valued, Marcus replied. If he gains control before the next lender review, he can present it as a major asset. Rachel placed a corporate presentation beside the filings. Richard's staff had already prepared projections showing Daniel's device generating hundreds of millions of dollars in future revenue. The presentation described Hale Meridian as the exclusive commercial partner, although Daniel had never approved such an arrangement. The patent was not simply an investment opportunity, it was a life raft. Without it, Richard's lenders could freeze additional credit, investors might demand withdrawals, and the entire structure could collapse under obligations he had hidden behind polished reports. Savannah had mistaken desperation for devotion. Rachel had followed her to several meetings with Richard over the previous year. He took her to private restaurants, gave her jewelry, and spoke about the future they would share once Daniel's company belonged to them. Savannah appeared to believe she would receive half of Richard's new medical investment division after the patent transfer. She had even drafted plans for selling our house after gaining control over my affairs. Part of the proceeds would fund what she called our new beginning. Richard had made no such plans. Among the documents Margaret collected was an email between Richard and his attorney. It referred to Savannah only by her initials. Once the Brooks transfer is complete, prepare a separation package. No equity. Confidentiality agreement required. Payment contingent on full cooperation. Another message was even clearer. She is useful because the husband trusts her. After the gala, that usefulness ends. Victor read the sentence twice. She destroyed her family for a man planning to pay her off. No, I said. She destroyed her family because she wanted what she believed he represented. Richard had recognized the hunger inside her and fed it carefully. He gave her access to wealthy rooms, expensive gifts, and promises that made ordinary loyalty seem small. He never needed to love her. He only needed her to believe that betrayal was the price of entering his world. The final piece was the gala. Hale Meridian planned to host investors, physicians, and financial reporters at a downtown hotel in less than 3 weeks. Richard intended to announce a revolutionary pediatric monitoring platform and present Daniel's patent as the centerpiece of a new fund. The event would reassure lenders before their quarterly review and attract enough new capital to delay the company's collapse. Savannah believed the gala would be the night Richard publicly chose her. Richard intended it to be the night he discarded her. I stared at the invitation Rachel had obtained. Richard's photograph appeared beneath the company logo, smiling with the confidence of a man certain that appearances could still protect him. He did not know that Margaret had already preserved the documents linking his companies to the stolen transfers. He did not know Daniel had begun questioning his wife. Most importantly, he did not know that the patent he considered his rescue could become the evidence that destroyed everything he had built. Richard Hale was not standing at the height of his empire. He was standing on its final unsupported floor, preparing a celebration while the foundation beneath him had already begun to crack. The emergency guardianship hearing was scheduled for a Monday morning, 10 days before Richard Hale's gala. Savannah had filed the petition late Friday afternoon, arguing that immediate action was necessary because I had become confused, unpredictable, and dangerous inside my own home. By the time Laura received notice, the court had already assigned a temporary hearing and requested a medical statement from Dr. Colin Mercer. Savannah moved faster than we expected. Her petition included photographs of the burner she had turned on, a written account of my missing car keys, and several short videos showing me pausing before answering simple questions. Each clip had been carefully framed. None showed what happened before or after. Together, they created the image of a grieving widower declining rapidly while refusing help. The most damaging document was Dr. Mercer's preliminary report. He described me as disoriented, emotionally unstable, and unable to understand the consequences of financial decisions. He recommended temporary supervision until a complete cognitive assessment could be performed. Laura read the report in Victor's dining room, her expression tightening with every paragraph. "This is not a final diagnosis," she said, "but it may be enough for the judge to impose temporary restrictions." "What kind of restrictions?" Victor asked. "Control over major financial transactions, limits on access to certain accounts, possibly a temporary guardian if the court believes Ethan is vulnerable." My throat tightened. Savannah did not need to own the house that morning. She only needed to place herself between me and every decision concerning it. Daniel sat beside her at the hearing. That hurt more than I expected. He did not look comfortable. His hands remained locked together, and he avoided my eyes whenever Savannah's attorney described me as confused. Yet when the judge asked whether he had observed changes in my behavior, Daniel answered honestly from the version of events he had been shown. "Yes," he said quietly. "My father has seemed different since my mother became ill." The statement was true. Grief had changed me. Savannah had built her case around the space between change and incapacity. Laura challenged Dr. Mercer's conclusions, pointing out that his evaluation had been brief and arranged without my independent counsel. She also submitted a letter from my longtime physician confirming that I had no history of dementia. Still, the judge was cautious. Courts were designed to prevent harm, and Savannah had presented herself as a devoted daughter-in-law, asking only for temporary protection. Then another blow arrived. During a short recess, Laura received a call from my bank because of the pending guardianship petition and an alert filed through one of Savannah's supporting documents. The institution had temporarily restricted access to several accounts until ownership and authority could be reviewed. Victor slammed his palm against the hallway wall. "She's already treating him like a prisoner." Laura lowered her voice. "Not a prisoner. A risk. That distinction is exactly how this works." I stared through the courthouse window at people moving along the sidewalk below. For decades, I had trusted records because records usually exposed deception. Now the records surrounding me had been arranged to tell a lie, and each new official stamp made the lie harder to remove. For the first time, I wondered whether Margaret's evidence had arrived too late. Laura sat beside me. "We need something direct," she said, something showing that Savannah manufactured the danger she reported. "Without that, the court may grant temporary authority while the investigation continues." Rachel had searched every file in the warehouse. Marcus had reviewed every transaction Margaret preserved. We had proof of financial misconduct, but nothing clearly connected Savannah's guardianship petition to deliberate fabrication. The hearing resumed 20 minutes later. Savannah's attorney requested that she be appointed temporary guardian for 30 days. Laura objected, but the judge began reviewing the proposed order. Then the courtroom doors opened. Victor entered carrying a small digital storage device and a handwritten note. He crossed directly to Laura and placed both items in her hand. "I found it behind Margaret's gardening books," he whispered. The note was in Margaret's handwriting. "If Savannah begins using the kitchen incidents, check the camera above the pantry door." Months earlier, after Savannah first suggested that I had become forgetful, Margaret had installed a small security camera facing the kitchen and hallway. She had never mentioned it because she was still deciding whether Savannah's behavior was manipulation or simple overprotectiveness. Victor had recovered the final week of saved footage. Laura requested a brief delay and showed the recording to Savannah's attorney before presenting it to the judge. The video displayed Savannah entering the empty kitchen, placing the saucepan on the stove, and turning the burner herself. Several minutes later, she called Daniel into the room and claimed I had left it on. Another clip showed her removing my car keys from their usual hook and placing them inside her purse. The courtroom became completely still. Daniel watched the screen without blinking. Savannah's face lost all color. The judge did not rule on the financial fraud, the patent, or the larger conspiracy. Those questions were not before the court, but she denied Savannah's request for temporary guardianship, ordered an independent cognitive evaluation, and referred the apparent fabrication of evidence for further review. Outside the courtroom, Daniel stood several feet from his wife. He did not confront her. Not yet. He only looked at her as though the woman beside him had become someone he no longer recognized. Savannah had entered the courthouse believing one official order would erase my voice. Instead, Margaret's quiet preparation had given it back. The court's refusal to grant Savannah temporary guardianship did not end the danger. It only changed the direction from which it approached. Laura warned me not to mistake one favorable ruling for safety. The judge had ordered an independent cognitive evaluation, and the recording from Margaret's kitchen had damaged Savannah's credibility. But the financial restrictions on my accounts had not yet been fully removed. The bank wanted written confirmation from the court, updated trust documents, and an internal review before restoring normal access. Savannah had failed to take control of my life. She had not stopped trying to control the story. At home, she told Daniel that the kitchen footage had been misunderstood. She claimed she had turned on the burner to test whether I would notice it, then panicked when Daniel entered before she could explain. The car keys, she said, had been moved because she feared I might drive while emotionally distressed. Each explanation was weak, but she delivered it with tears and wounded patience. Daniel did not argue. He also did not comfort her. For the first time, silence existed between them without Savannah controlling what it meant. While their marriage began to fracture, the evidence Margaret had preserved moved into hands with the authority to act. Marcus did not contact former colleagues improperly or ask anyone for favors. He helped Laura and Rachel prepare a clean, organized referral package containing the altered transfer authorizations, the shell company connections, the patent documents, and Margaret's lawful recording. Laura submitted the estate-related evidence through the proper legal channels. Rachel provided her investigative records and supporting sources. Daniel's company attorney, after privately reviewing several suspicious transactions, made a separate report concerning possible intellectual property theft and wire fraud. The agencies did not tell us everything they were doing. They were not supposed to. What we learned came through formal requests and carefully limited conversations. Federal investigators had already been reviewing unusual activity involving several companies connected to Hale Meridian Ventures. Margaret's files did not create the investigation from nothing. They gave it a clear path toward Richard, Savannah, and Daniel's patent. The bank began preserving records rather than merely restricting access. Financial regulators requested documents related to Richard's investment claims. Investigators compared the patent materials in Hale Meridian's promotional presentation with the versions filed by Daniel's company. The plan was no longer ours alone. That brought relief, but it also required surrender. For years, I had followed evidence until I understood every turn. Now I had to accept that lawful investigations moved according to rules I could not command. I could provide facts, protect what remained, and wait. I could not choose the date of a search warrant or decide when an account should be frozen. Margaret's warning returned often. Let the law do what anger cannot. Rachel met Daniel 3 days after the hearing. She chose a quiet conference room in Laura's office, away from Savannah and the company systems she might monitor. Daniel arrived expecting to discuss my estate. Instead, Rachel placed the Northline transactions, altered patent documents, and photographs of Savannah with Richard on the table. My son stared at the first photograph for nearly a minute. No, he said. Rachel did not argue. She showed him the next image, then the next. Daniel examined the transaction he had found in Savannah's drawer and compared it with 2 others carrying the same electronic signature. One had been approved while he was presenting at a medical conference in Chicago. Another had been authorized while he sat beside Margaret in hospice. His face seemed to age as he read. Did my mother know? Yes, Rachel answered. For how long? Long enough to try giving Savannah a chance to stop. Daniel lowered his head. Rachel did not play Margaret's full recording. That would happen when Laura believed the evidence was secure. She shared only enough to make Daniel understand that his mother had not been confused, jealous, or suspicious without reason. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red. "What does my father know more than you think?" Daniel pressed both hands against the table. "Why didn't he tell me?" "Because he was protecting the evidence, and because he still believed you deserved the chance to see the truth for yourself." Daniel left without confronting Savannah. He returned home, ate dinner across from her, and watched her describe the upcoming gala as the event that would secure his company's future. 2 days later, a formal invitation arrived for both of them. Heavy cream paper, embossed lettering, Richard Hale's name across the top. Savannah held it as though it were proof that every sacrifice she had made was about to be rewarded. Daniel read it as evidence that the final lie had already been scheduled. The Hale Meridian Gala occupied the largest ballroom of the Grand Rally Hotel, a place built to make wealth appear permanent. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished floors. Waiters moved between guests carrying champagne, and enormous screens displayed images of laboratories, healthy children, and glowing financial projections. Every detail suggested certainty. Richard Hale stood near the stage, greeting investors with the confidence of a man who believed presentation could outrun consequence. His dark tuxedo fit perfectly, his silver hair was carefully arranged, and his smile never revealed the pressure beneath it. Savannah remained close to him whenever Daniel looked away. She wore a deep red gown and the diamond bracelet Richard had given her months earlier. Watching her cross the ballroom, I understood how completely she had surrendered herself to the future he promised. She did not see a married woman standing beside the man helping her steal from her husband. She saw someone about to be welcomed into a world she believed had always belonged to other people. Daniel stood several feet away, surrounded by physicians and potential investors. He wore the expression he used during difficult presentations, attentive, controlled, and unreadable. Savannah appeared reassured by his silence. She believed he was nervous about the announcement. She did not know he had already given his company attorney copies of the unauthorized transfers. She did not know Rachel had shown him the photographs. She did not know he had spent the previous night listening to the portion of Margaret's recording in which his mother offered Savannah one final chance to tell the truth. Victor and Laura entered through a side corridor. Rachel was already inside, seated near the back with representatives from Daniel's legal team. Federal investigators had not told us when or how they intended to act. Laura reminded me that the gala was not our courtroom, and I was not there to pronounce anyone guilty. I was there because Daniel needed to see the truth revealed where the lie had been designed to triumph. I waited in a private room upstairs until Richard began his presentation. The charcoal suit Margaret had saved for me still fit across the shoulders, though the man wearing it had changed. I adjusted the cuffs before the mirror and touched the handwritten note I had placed inside the breast pocket. "You were never weak. You simply chose gentleness." For weeks, Savannah had seen a grieving old man who could not find his keys, remember a date, or defend his own decisions. That man had never existed, but the grief remained with me as I entered the elevator and descended toward the ballroom. Richard's voice reached the hallway before I stepped through the doors. "Tonight, Hale Meridian Ventures is proud to introduce a breakthrough in pediatric cardiac monitoring." Applause rose from the audience. A digital rendering of Daniel's device appeared on the screens. Beneath it, the Hale Meridian logo expanded across the display, while Richard spoke of exclusive commercialization rights, international partnerships, and a new medical technology fund. Daniel's name was mentioned only once, as though 6 years of his life had been a minor contribution to Richard's vision. Then Richard invited Savannah onto the stage. She looked toward Daniel with rehearsed hesitation, waiting for him to approve the surprise. Daniel did not move. Richard introduced her as a strategic advisor who had helped secure the company's relationship with the Brooks technology platform. Savannah accepted the applause as if it were the sound of a door opening. That was when I entered. At first, no one paid attention. An elderly man walking quietly through a crowded ballroom, rarely became the center of anything. A waiter offered me a tray, mistaking me for someone searching for a drink. I declined and continued toward the stage. Savannah saw me first. Her smile disappeared. Richard followed her gaze, then looked toward Daniel as though expecting an explanation. Daniel gave him none. I stopped at the front table. In my hand was a cream-colored envelope prepared by Laura. It contained no threats, no dramatic demand, and no claim that I controlled the investigation. Inside were copies of the trust records, the original patent filings, the altered transfer documents, Margaret's transcript, and formal notices confirming that Daniel's attorneys disputed every ownership claim Richard was presenting. I held the envelope out to my son. "This belongs to you," I said. Daniel descended from the stage and accepted it with both hands. Savannah hurried toward us. "Daniel, this is not the place. Your father is still confused." Her voice was low, but the microphone near the stage carried it across the room. Daniel opened the envelope. The first page showed his original patent application and the filing date. The next showed a later assignment document carrying his electronic signature. Attached beneath it was the record proving the authorization had occurred while he sat beside Margaret during her hospital procedure. He turned another page. Photographs of Savannah and Richard. Northline transfers. Emails discussing the gala. The separation agreement Richard intended Savannah to sign after the patent announcement. She stared at that final document longer than anything else. "No," she whispered. Richard stepped down from the stage. "These materials are stolen and misleading." Laura moved forward. "They were obtained lawfully and have already been provided to the appropriate authorities." Richard reached for the envelope, but Daniel pulled it away. On the ballroom screens, the promotional presentation suddenly disappeared. Daniel's company attorney had instructed the hotel's technical staff to stop displaying materials under disputed ownership. The room fell silent. Richard's polished confidence finally cracked. Savannah looked from him to Daniel, then toward me. For the first time, she understood that the frail widower she had tried to erase had never been the weakest person in the room. The final lie had been spoken publicly. Now everyone who had invested in it was watching it collapse. Richard recovered first, or at least he tried to. He stepped toward the microphone and raised one hand, calling the documents incomplete and the interruption a private family dispute. His voice still carried the practiced authority that had persuaded investors to overlook difficult questions for years. But the room had changed. Guests were no longer listening with admiration. They were checking phones, whispering to attorneys, and studying the man on stage as though the surface of his success had suddenly become transparent. "This presentation concerns valid commercial agreements," Richard said. "Any ownership dispute will be resolved through the proper legal process." Daniel stood below him holding the envelope. "There was no valid agreement," he answered. Richard's gaze hardened. "You signed the assignment." "I did not." The simplicity of Daniel's response carried farther than shouting would have. Savannah moved between them. "Daniel, please. You're overwhelmed. Your mother just died. Your father has been manipulating you, and these people are using your grief." She reached for his arm, but he stepped back. Before she could speak again, the ballroom doors opened. Several federal agents entered with hotel security and 2 attorneys representing financial regulators. They did not rush or shout. Their calm made the interruption more frightening. One agent approached Richard, identified himself, and asked him to step away from the stage. Richard stared at Laura. "You arranged this." "No," she said. "Your records did." Another agent informed the guests that Hale Meridian's presentation materials and certain business records were subject to federal preservation orders. Representatives from Richard's primary bank moved toward his chief financial officer, who had begun reading urgent messages on his phone. The bank had frozen access to several Hale Meridian accounts pending investigation. Financial regulators had also issued notices related to allegedly misleading investment statements and disputed intellectual property claims. Richard's confidence finally disappeared. He turned toward Savannah. "What did you give them?" Her mouth fell open. "Nothing. You had access to Daniel's accounts. You handled the transfers. You told me how to do it. I told you to obtain lawful authorization." The lie arrived so quickly that even Savannah seemed unprepared for it. She stared at him. "You created Northline." Richard's attorney seized his arm and told him to stop speaking, but panic had already loosened the careful discipline behind his public image. "I never instructed you to forge anything," Richard said. "Whatever happened inside your husband's company was your responsibility." Savannah looked toward the separation agreement still visible among the papers in Daniel's hands. The future Richard had promised her had vanished, leaving only the truth Margaret had understood long before Richard had never planned to stand beside her when consequences arrived. "You said we were partners," she whispered. Richard did not answer. An agent asked him to turn around and place his hands behind his back. The handcuffs closed around his wrists without spectacle. Cameras rose throughout the ballroom, not from reporters alone, but from guests who had spent the evening believing they were witnessing the beginning of another successful venture. Savannah backed away from him. Then she turned toward Daniel. "You know why I did this," she said. "You were never home. Everything was your company, your research, your mother. I carried your life while you treated me like an assistant." Daniel looked at her with an exhaustion deeper than anger. "You carried my life so you could empty it. I loved you. You monitored my calls. You stole my signature. You helped them call my father incompetent." Savannah shook her head rapidly. "I was protecting us." "No, you were protecting the life you wanted after you left me." Her eyes filled with tears, but Daniel did not move toward her. He removed his wedding ring slowly, as though the act required more strength than anything else he had done that night. He placed it on top of the forged patent assignment. "You didn't just betray me," he said. "You stole my parents from me." The words broke something in her that the agents, the frozen accounts, and Richard's betrayal had not. Savannah reached for the ring, then stopped before touching it. Around her, the ballroom remained silent. There was no applause, no celebration, and no satisfaction in watching a marriage end. There was only the terrible clarity of consequences arriving after every warning had been ignored. An investigator approached Savannah and informed her that she was being detained for questioning regarding identity theft, financial fraud, falsified records, and the attempted manipulation of guardianship proceedings. She began denying everything, then accused Richard, then claimed Daniel had authorized the transfers verbally. Each new explanation contradicted the one before it. Richard was led toward one exit. Savannah was escorted toward another. They never looked at each other again. Daniel remained beside the abandoned stage, staring at the ring and the papers beneath it. I moved close enough for him to know I was there, but I did not touch him until he turned toward me. "I believed her," he said. "I know. I helped her hurt you. You were deceived, Daniel. But what you do after learning the truth belongs to you." He lowered his head, and for the first time since childhood, my son leaned against me without trying to hide that he needed support. Behind us, investors hurried from the ballroom while attorneys collected documents and federal agents secured Richard's records. The empire he had presented as permanent was collapsing through the ordinary machinery of evidence, procedure, and law. Margaret had been right. Anger could have destroyed Savannah for one night. The truth would make certain she could never do the same thing to another family. 9 months passed before the legal cases reached their conclusions. Time did not heal everything in the gentle way people often promised. Some mornings, I still woke expecting to hear Margaret moving through the kitchen. I would lie still for several seconds, listening for the soft opening of a cabinet or the scrape of her chair across the floor. Then memory returned, and the house became quiet again. What time did offer was distance. It gave the truth enough room to separate itself from the chaos surrounding it. Richard Hale pleaded guilty to multiple counts involving wire fraud, falsified investment statements, and conspiracy to misappropriate intellectual property. Investigators discovered that Daniel's patent was only one part of a much larger pattern. Richard had inflated company values, concealed losses from investors, and moved money between related entities to prevent lenders from seeing how unstable Hale Meridian had become. He received a federal prison sentence and was ordered to surrender assets connected to the fraud. The polished offices, leased aircraft, and expensive homes disappeared into bankruptcy proceedings. Investors who once treated his confidence as proof of wisdom now studied his name as a warning. Savannah's case was more personal. She initially denied everything, then blamed Richard, then claimed Daniel had given her informal permission to manage the transfers. The kitchen recordings, forged signatures, emails, and financial records left little room for those explanations. Her attempt to manipulate the guardianship process became an important part of the prosecution because it showed how she had tried to remove the person most likely to challenge her. Eventually, Savannah accepted a plea agreement. She was sentenced for identity theft, financial fraud, falsifying records, and conspiracy. The court also prohibited her from serving as a guardian, trustee, or financial agent for another vulnerable adult after her release. Daniel testified at both proceedings. It was not an act of revenge. It was the first difficult step in taking responsibility for what his silence and misplaced trust had allowed. He did not excuse Savannah, but he also stopped describing himself as someone to whom events had merely happened. "I did not commit her crimes," he told me after one hearing, "but I ignored people who loved me because believing her was easier than asking questions. I understood the difference." Responsibility was not the same as guilt. It was the decision to change what came next. The patent returned fully to Daniel's company. He refused Richard's model of rapid expansion and rebuilt slowly, bringing in independent advisors and placing stronger controls around every financial decision. The device eventually completed its regulatory review and entered a limited hospital program for children with congenital heart conditions. Daniel could have used the renewed attention to make himself famous. Instead, he created the Margaret Brooks Foundation. The foundation funded legal consultations for older adults facing financial exploitation, supported families navigating guardianship disputes, and provided small grants to patients who could not afford specialized cardiac monitoring. Laura served on its advisory board. Rachel helped develop fraud prevention workshops. Marcus reviewed the financial safeguards, though he complained about every meeting lasting longer than an hour. Victor became the foundation's unofficial greeter. He claimed this was because no one else knew how to make decent coffee. My relationship with Daniel healed more slowly than the company did. He apologized many times, but apologies could not restore the months when he had watched Savannah question my judgment and said nothing. We learned not to demand immediate forgiveness from each other. He began visiting every Sunday, sometimes to talk, sometimes only to help in the garden. We discussed money, medical decisions, and the future with an honesty our family should have practiced years earlier. When Daniel suggested I move into his new house, I thanked him and refused. Loving me, he was beginning to understand, did not give him authority over my life. The independent evaluation ordered by the court confirmed that I was cognitively healthy. Still, I updated every document with Laura. I named multiple trusted contacts, added protections against unilateral changes, and placed the house permanently within the Margaret Brooks Trust. The front rooms became a small community office where volunteer attorneys met older adults concerned about suspicious contracts, sudden account changes, or relatives pressuring them to sign away control. The garden remained mine. Margaret would not have forgiven me for sacrificing the hydrangeas to office parking. Victor continued arriving most mornings with coffee. We sat on the back porch while volunteers came and went through the house. Some visitors carried folders, others carried fear. I recognized the look of people who had been made to feel foolish for asking whether someone they loved might be taking advantage of them. We never promised that every family could be repaired. We only reminded them that age did not erase their voice. On the first anniversary of Margaret's death, Daniel and I visited the cemetery together. He placed white lilies beside her headstone, then stepped away to give me a moment alone. I told Margaret about the foundation, the children using Daniel's device, and the people receiving help in the house she had protected. I told her Daniel was learning to become a better man, and that I was learning how to be his father without shielding him from every consequence. The wind moved gently through the trees. For months, I had believed Margaret left behind a plan to save me from Savannah. Standing beside her grave, I finally understood that her purpose had been larger. She had not prepared revenge. She had prepared a path back to ourselves. I rested my hand against the cool stone. "You didn't save me," I whispered. "You saved all of us." Then I returned home to her garden, where new flowers were beginning to bloom.